Omnibot, the state of the fun robot.
That American children these days are obsessed with the whole disgusting.
Where do you keep them? In the Trapper Keeper.
In the 1980s, some trends burned bright and vanished just as fast, leaving behind nothing but forgotten dreams and a few bittersweet laughs. Why did the ideas we once chased so proudly fall apart almost before we even knew they were gone? Let us start with something that tried way too hard to be the future of entertainment. The video disc player, specifically RCA's capacitance electronic disc, or CED for short, except we are not using abbreviations here, so let us just call it what it was. A huge plastic record that you shoved into a machine in hopes of watching a movie. It looked like vinyl, but it definitely was not groovy. You needed a special player, the discs were fragile and rewinding. Not happening. It was like asking your television to do a ballet recital while wearing hiking boots. It launched in the early 1980s and flopped so hard that even RCA, the company behind it, backed out just a few years later. People already had VHS tapes. They had beta tapes. Nobody asked for a third format that looked like a frisbee and handled like a toddler on a sugar rush. Sure, the packaging was cool, but it was a disaster in living rooms. It took up space and made too much noise, and not the good kind. This thing had all the flash and none of the function. But if you thought that was loud, wait until you see what came down the slopes wearing a highlighter. Skiing was never the same once neon showed up. I am talking full spectrum, retina-searing neon, electric pink, screaming lime green, safety cone orange, sometimes all at once. You were not skiing. You were glowing. The 1980s fashion scene decided subtlety was canceled, and nowhere was that more obvious than on the slopes. It was like someone dared the ski community to look like walking glow sticks, and they all said, "Challenge accepted." Ski suits looked like outer space met a Lisa Frank notebook. But here is the thing. When the snow settled, all that color had nowhere to go. Once the decade ended, people looked at their slope selfies and realized they had been dressing like traffic signs. Neon was everywhere for a hot minute. Even the zippers had attitude. And if you were not blinded by your jacket, then someone else's was probably reflecting directly into your eyes. That was not just fashion, it was a safety hazard. But at least you had room to move, right? Speaking of movement, the next 1980s trend thought bouncing was the future of fitness and fun, and totally not sprained ankles. Now imagine being a kid in the 1980s. You see a commercial where a kid is floating through the air like they are on the moon. Enter moon shoes, mini trampolines for your feet. A miracle of plastic, rubber bands, and hope. The packaging promised anti-gravity fun. But what you got was 2 slabs of plastic that shook your ankles into submission. You strapped them onto your sneakers, took a few hopeful jumps, and within 5 minutes, you were sitting on the ground nursing a bruised shin. They were supposed to be fun. Instead, they became an unofficial rite of passage for backyard injuries. Sure, you might get one satisfying bounce in before the strap snapped off or your foot twisted sideways like it had a mind of its own. But that did not stop kids from begging for them. We were promised space adventures. We got orthopedic bills. Still, for one fleeting second, you felt like an astronaut. And then you remembered you were just in the driveway, stuck in a pair of squeaky plastic traps. But if your feet were not being tortured, chances are your telephone was, because the next trend had a serious case of over-accessorizing. Before cell phones, there were landlines. And before minimalism, there were designer phone covers. And boy, did the 1980s go all in. You could not just have a phone, you had to dress it. We are talking fur-lined receivers, leopard print handsets, and rhinestone-covered cradles. Nothing screamed glamour, like trying to have a conversation with what looked like a bedazzled chinchilla pressed against your ear. There was even one that looked like a hamburger. Why? No one really knows. But the 1980s were not about asking why. They were about asking, does this come in glitter pink? People wanted their rotary phones to match their shag carpet and floral wallpaper, and these accessories delivered poorly. The covers fell apart. They muffled the sound. And let us be honest, No emergency call was improved by digging through a layer of sequins. It turned something simple into a full-time job. You had to prepare to use your phone. The trend eventually fizzled out, mostly because the novelty wore off and the practicality never existed in the first place. Still, the 1980s loved their flair, especially when you could wear it, like, say, around your neck in the most jingly way possible. You knew a kid was cool if their necklace made noise from down the hallway. Enter the plastic charm necklace. These things were a fashion statement and a choking hazard all rolled into one. A long, brightly colored chain that you decked out with dozens of plastic trinkets. Mini roller skates, tiny telephones, hair dryers, soda bottles, and anything else the size of your thumb. The more charms, the better. It was like curating your own loud, clunky resume of childhood interests. Everyone traded them. Everyone bragged about having the rare ones. And of course, the plastic was cheap enough to snap if you breathed on it wrong. Teachers hated them. Parents hated stepping on them. But kids loved how collectible they felt. That is, until the day you leaned over your desk and your entire charm empire dumped itself on the floor like a sad little toy avalanche. Still, for a while, they were the perfect combination of fashion and fun. And speaking of things that looked fun but failed to function properly, do you remember the sweet-smelling school supply that never actually worked? Let us talk about rubber-scented erasers shaped like food. You knew it was going to be a good school year when your pencil case smelled like a fruit salad. Rubber-scented erasers shaped like food were the peak of academic excitement in the 1980s. They looked like tiny hamburgers, donuts, pickles, even sushi rolls. If you were lucky, your set came with a tiny tray and a fake soda. They were bright, colorful, and smelled like someone spilled a bottle of air freshener in an art supply store. Only problem? They did not actually erase anything. If anything, they left behind more streaks than they removed. Still, no one really used them. You displayed them. You traded them. You clutched them like they were gold. And every now and then, someone tried to eat one just to see what would happen. It was childhood logic at its finest. If it smells like a strawberry milkshake, it must taste like one too, right? Wrong. But what these erasers lacked in function, they made up for in flair. They were tiny scented trophies of your youth. And while they never helped you pass math, they sure looked good on your desk. Speaking of things that looked great on the surface but did not last, let us hit play on a sound that defined a decade and then disappeared overnight. The synthesizer, the drum machine, the shoulder pads, all came together for the golden age of synthpop in the 1980s. And while some bands carved out legacies that still echo today, there were many that burst onto the scene with one song, rode the radio waves hard, and then vanished like a fog machine in a gymnasium. These were the one-hit wonders of synthpop, groups with names that sounded like computer errors, album covers that looked like laser tag invitations, and beats that could only be danced to under a disco ball or beneath neon lights. You probably remember the song, maybe even the music video, but ask someone to name a second track and all you will get is a confused look. They were catchy, addictive, and short-lived. It was like the sound itself had an expiration date. Still, the moment they were hot, they were hot. The genre was all style, minimal substance, and maximum eyeliner. But when the synthesizer started to fade and guitars came roaring back, these acts had nowhere to go. Much like their lyrics, they just drifted into the static. But if the music was fleeting, the next trend tried to leave its mark forever, sometimes quite literally, on your notebook paper. You were not just writing letters in the 1980s. You were sending sensory experiences. Perfumed stationery sets were the peak of pen pal drama. Heart-shaped pages with lace borders, sparkly envelopes, and enough floral scent to knock out a small room. There were sets that smelled like roses, vanilla, ocean breeze, or something suspiciously like bubblegum and detergent. You would open a note from your best friend and nearly pass out from the aroma. It was like the page had bathed in perfume and never toweled off. They were beautiful, romantic, and borderline unreadable. The ink would smudge from the coated paper. The scent would linger for days. And if you tried mailing one of these in the heat, good luck. The envelope might as well have been dipped in cologne. Still, it was all part of the charm. These notes were not meant to last forever. They were moments frozen in scent. They smelled like crushes and sleepovers and secrets told in cursive. But not all nostalgia smells sweet. Because the next 1980s trend? It came with a can of hairspray, a comb, and enough height to qualify as a fire hazard. There are hairstyles, and then there are structural engineering projects. Gravity-defying bangs, held aloft by industrial-strength hairspray, were the crown jewels of 1980s style. We are talking sky-high, shellacked to perfection, immovable bangs that could survive a hurricane. You did not just style your hair, you sculpted it. And the glue that held it all together? A can of Aquanet, the unofficial perfume of the decade. One spritz was never enough. You held that button down until the room filled with fog and your lungs begged for mercy. It was how you knew your bangs were officially done. They had to crunch when you tapped them. These bangs had volume, attitude, and possibly their own zip code. They required teasing, patience, and a total disregard for the ozone layer. Parents disapproved. Schools banned combs in lockers. But if your bangs did not touch the ceiling of your school photo backdrop, were you even living? It was extreme. It was ridiculous. And it was glorious. But eventually, the sky-high trend lost steam, and Pastel Blazers tried to take over the fashion throne. Spoiler alert, not everyone could pull off Crockett from Miami Vice. There was a time when men's fashion turned into a pastel explosion. Inspired by Miami Vice, Pastel Blazers became the go-to power move for any guy who wanted to look cool, sophisticated, and vaguely like he sold luxury boats. The look was unmistakable. Shoulder-padded jackets in baby blue, mint green, or pale pink, paired with white pants and an attitude. You rolled up the sleeves. You wore it over a t-shirt. Bonus points if you wore loafers with no socks. It was supposed to say, confident renegade. More often, it said, confused ice cream vendor. It was television fantasy brought into everyday wardrobes, and it did not always survive the transition. Most men were not undercover detectives in Miami. They were accountants in Michigan. The style clashed with the office cubicles and suburban backyards where it showed up. And once the show faded from prime time, so did the look. The pastel blazer became fashion's forgotten relic. But if you thought that was an eyesore, wait until you see the avalanche of snot, slime, and absurdity that came from the most chaotic merchandise blitz of the 1980s. Garbage Pail Kids were just getting started. If you were a kid in the 1980s, there were two ways to rebel. You could get grounded, or you could collect Garbage Pail Kids. What started as a gross-out parody of wholesome Cabbage Patch Kids quickly mutated into one of the most controversial and overstimulating franchises of the decade. The trading cards were wild enough, oozing noses, melting eyeballs, radioactive vomit. But that was just the beginning. Suddenly, they were everywhere. Garbage Pail Kids lunchboxes, bed sheets, pajamas, notebooks, puzzles, even Halloween costumes. It was like someone said, "What if childhood was more disgusting?" And the market responded, "Yes, please." Parents hated them. Teachers banned them. Some schools even confiscated them on site. But for kids, they were pure rebellion in sticker form. Every new pack was a gamble. Would you get Atom Bomb or Leaky Lindsay? Either way, it was peak 1980s absurdity. But the brand overdid it. What once felt underground became overexposed. And by the time the infamous Garbage Pail Kids movie dropped in theaters, it was game over. Gross became exhausting. The merch wave collapsed under its own snot-covered weight. Still, it was fun while it lasted. Now, let us talk about another trend that looked sweet and innocent, until summer arrived and your feet begged for mercy. Jelly shoes were like candy for your feet. Glittery, colorful, and see-through, they looked like something out of a candy store window. You could get them in bubblegum pink, lemon yellow, clear with glitter, or even lavender sparkle. They were cheap, they were cute, and if you were a kid in the 1980s, you had to have a pair. But once you wore them for more than 10 minutes, that is when the nightmare started. These things had no ventilation. Your feet would sweat like they were in a greenhouse. By midday, your socks were soaked. Or worse, you were wearing them barefoot. and the plastic would start sticking to your skin like flypaper. The straps would dig into your ankles. Blisters were basically part of the experience. And the smell? Let us just say it was somewhere between melted plastic and shame. Still, they were a rite of passage, and fashion pain was part of growing up. But if jelly shoes were a questionable fashion choice, the next trend somehow managed to make your middle school photo look like a science fiction movie poster, and not in a good way. You sat in a folding chair, you stared ahead, and then the photographer said, "Say cheese," while lasers exploded behind you. That is right. We are talking about laser backgrounds in school photos. For some reason, every kid in the 1980s decided the best way to capture the innocence of youth was to be immortalized against a backdrop that looked like a Star Trek rave. Bright blue and hot pink lasers crisscrossed behind you like you were dodging security beams in a heist movie. You could be wearing a Mickey Mouse sweatshirt, and the background would make you look like you were breaking into NASA. It was peak 1980s over-the-topness. Loud, flashy, and totally unnecessary. But somehow every kid wanted it. It was the photo choice that said, "I am ready for the future." And also recess. Parents either loved it or groaned at it. And looking back now, it is a nostalgic masterpiece of absurdity. Sure, it aged poorly, but there is something kind of wonderful about a generation that thought lasers made everything better. That includes the next wild invention too, tiny wrist gadgets that promised futuristic fun but usually conked out before lunchtime. If you had a motorized toy watch in the 1980s, you were basically James Bond for about a day. These things were advertised as cutting-edge wearable tech for kids. They came with secret compartments, built-in games, tiny motors, and sometimes a mini flashlight that barely lit up a crayon box. It was like strapping a malfunctioning robot to your wrist. The appeal was instant. They looked cool, they blinked, they buzzed, but they rarely did any of it well. Most of the time, they stopped working after a couple of recesses. Batteries died fast, buttons got stuck, the motors jammed. And the plastic? Usually cracked if you smacked it against a desk. But for that brief window when it worked, you felt invincible. Until the alarm started going off randomly in class and your teacher confiscated it. Or worse, you opened the compartment only to find that whatever secret feature it had just did not. But still, you wore it proudly, because style always beat functionality in the 1980s. And nowhere was that more true than in the next trend, a fashion accessory that tried to blast your favorite jams but mostly just sat on your hip doing nothing at all. The mini boombox was supposed to be the coolest thing you could clip onto your belt. A pint-sized party machine, a radio revolution in your pocket. But in reality, it was all look, no boom. These things were everywhere in the late 1980s, bright, plastic, and usually in neon colors that matched your windbreaker. They were meant to let you carry your music wherever you went, like a portable dance party. Except the sound quality was trash. The volume was barely louder than a whisper. If you were outside, forget it. Wind was louder. And the tape deck? Constantly ate your favorite cassette, if it even had a tape deck. A lot of them were just FM radios disguised as full-function players. But hey, they looked cool. They had fake speakers, shiny knobs, and some even had stickers that made them look high-tech. You could strut down the sidewalk, mini boombox on your hip, headphones plugged in, until the batteries died an hour later. And that was the end of that. So yes, it flopped. But it flopped with style. And if you thought that was noisy, wait until we revisit the school supply that became an auditory menace in classrooms across America. The Velcro symphony known as the Trapper Keeper. The Trapper Keeper was not just a binder, it was a lifestyle. This glorious slab of plastic with vibrant covers, think unicorns, neon grids, or random geometric chaos, was the crown jewel of any school supply list in the 1980s. But what really made it iconic? That Velcro closure. The loud, slow rip of peeling open your binder was like a thunderclap in homeroom. One kid opened theirs? Fine. 20 kids did it at once? It sounded like the floor was being ripped up. Teachers hated it. Students loved it. The inside was perfectly organized with color-coded folders, pockets for notes, and room for a calculator or 3 scented pens. But the noise, that was the deal breaker. Eventually, some schools banned them altogether, citing disruption of learning, which is code for "this binder is louder than the morning announcements." But let us be honest, part of the appeal was the noise. It said, "I am prepared and I am here to cause mild chaos." The Trapper Keeper burned bright, and then it was gone. But if you were not cradling one of these masterpieces, you were probably outside spinning on something equally unnecessary and questionably effective. Let us talk about the portable dance revolution that was basically just fancy cardboard. Before padded gym floors and TikTok dance tutorials, there was the breakdancing board. It was exactly what it sounds like: a portable, foldable square of cardboard with a brick wall graphic or checkerboard print meant to simulate the streets. Because nothing says urban grit like unfolding a fake alleyway in your suburban driveway. These things were lightweight, glossy, and slid around on every surface. In theory, they let you spin, pop, and lock without bruising your spine on concrete. In reality, they slid out from under you mid-move, causing more scraped elbows than applause. But in the moment, they felt cool. They turned any parking lot into a stage. Throw on some Run DMC, slap that cardboard down, and suddenly you were in it. Never mind that it bent after 2 uses and warped in the rain. You were performing. You were part of something. Until the corner curled up or the board tore in half while trying to nail a backspin. But that was the 80s. Function took a backseat to flair. And speaking of flair, our next trend lets you turn every sweatshirt into a personal fashion statement or a wearable art disaster. The 1980s were not just colorful, they were textured. Enter Puffy Paint clothing projects, where kids became designers and your closet turned into a craft aisle. You would grab an oversized sweatshirt, some neon puffy paint, and go to town. Maybe your name in bubble letters. Maybe a dolphin jumping over a rainbow. Maybe just abstract blobs of color that looked like a melted ice cream truck. The point was not perfection. It was personality. These paints dried thick and rubbery, forming crusty shapes that cracked after one wash. And forget drying time. You had to leave that sweatshirt on a hanger for a day, hoping no one touched it and left fingerprints in the masterpiece. Once dry, you wore it proudly, to school, to the mall, to family dinner. But comfort? Out the window. The back of the paint rubbed against your skin like sandpaper. Heaven forbid someone hugged you. You would both end up glittery. Still, it was a rite of creative passage. You were a walking art exhibit whether you liked it or not. But if you thought your sweatshirt was stiff, wait until you remember the home appliance that tried to combine 2 technologies and ended up giving you the worst of both worlds. Some inventions solve problems, others create them. The television with a built-in VHS player was supposed to be the ultimate convenience. One machine, one cord, one less reason to crawl behind the entertainment center. But this Frankenstein creation was as clunky as it was cursed. The built-in player jammed constantly. Tapes got eaten, ejected halfway through, or refused to rewind. And if the television broke, say goodbye to your movie nights. Repairs were complicated and expensive. If the VHS part failed, you were stuck with a giant screen that could not play anything. If the television part failed, you had a glorified tape storage box. The worst was when you were watching something and the tape chewed itself mid-scene, turning your favorite film into spaghetti. Still, it looked high-tech at the time, and for a short while, having one meant you were fancy. But like many 1980s trends, style outpaced practicality, and homes across America quietly swapped them out for separates once again. But if you wanted to keep the glow alive without the bulk, the next trend did it in the smallest, brightest way possible. Let us talk about glowing in the dark on everything. If the lights went out in the 1980s, chances are something in your room lit up. Glow-in-the-dark stickers were slapped on every surface known to humankind. Bedroom ceilings became constellations. Alarm clocks glowed like miniature UFOs. Light switch covers, shoelaces, trapper keepers, even toothbrushes. Nothing was safe from the radioactive green charm of phosphorescent novelty. And as a kid, it was magic. You charged them up under a lamp, turned off the lights, and suddenly your room was a planetarium. Sort of. The glow would last about 30 seconds. And then, nothing. But those 30 seconds? Pure wonder. The problem came when the adhesive gave out and the stickers peeled off, leaving weird, dusty outlines on your walls. Or when the glow effect faded completely, leaving behind little blobs of dead plastic. Still, the trend exploded. Kids wanted to glow. Toys were made with it. T-shirts were printed with it. Some even tried to make glow-in-the-dark nail polish. The 80s loved the idea of visibility, especially in the dark. But while glowing stars were subtle, the next trend was anything but. Let us talk about the fashion moment that made teenagers look like they were headed straight for the football field. Shoulder pads, anyone? Let us be real. Shoulder pads were not just a fashion statement. They were a fashion exclamation. And somehow they trickled down from business suits and power blazers to teenagers. Yes, nothing says youthful rebellion quite like looking like you are gearing up for a scrimmage with the Chicago Bears. In the 1980s, you could barely pick up a sweater or jacket without finding a pair of foam triangles stuffed into the lining. For adults, it was about power dressing. For teens, it was just confusing. You would throw on your favorite sweatshirt and suddenly look like a linebacker on picture day. They made you look older, broader, and weirdly more square. Removing them was a gamble. They were usually sewn in with all the stubbornness of a century-old family secret. But for a while, they were everywhere. Dances, school photos, family reunions. Looking back, it is hard to say what the appeal really was. Maybe we all wanted to look like business executives trapped in high school. But if shoulder pads were trying to make kids look powerful, the next musical invention went even further. It said, let us wear our entire keyboard as a guitar. Let us talk about the rise and rapid fall of the keytar. Ah yes, the keytar, half keyboard, half guitar, and fully committed to stealing the spotlight. In the 1980s, nothing screamed, I am serious about synth, like strapping a keyboard around your neck and rocking out like you were in a heavy metal band. And for a moment, it worked. Music videos featured them. Pop stars slung them over their shoulders like electric weapons of sound. The design was bold. The colors were wild. And the idea? Genius. It freed keyboardists from the shadows of the stage and let them strut front and center. But here's the thing. It still looked goofy. It was long, awkward, and required a very specific kind of confidence to pull off. If you did not have that swagger, you just looked like you were struggling with a giant broken remote control. And once the synthpop wave cooled down, so did the excitement. The keytar slid back into its weird niche corner of music history. But hey, at least it tried to make instruments cool. The same cannot be said for what came next. Because sometimes all it took to ruin your outfit was a pair of plastic sunglasses shaped like a lightning bolt. There are sunglasses, and then there are plastic sunglasses in wild shapes, triangles, stars, lightning bolts, even squiggles. These were not designed for function. They were designed for flair. And in the 1980s, flair was everything. You could barely see out of them. The lenses were tiny. The shapes made no ergonomic sense. But when you slipped them on, you felt like the king or queen of style until you walked into a wall. These shades were perfect for a costume party, maybe a concert, but not much else. They pinched your temples. They slid off your nose, and God help you if you wore them outside. You would squint harder than a mole in the sun. Still, for kids and teens, they were a badge of honor. They screamed individuality. They screamed rebellion. They also screamed, I bought these from a vending machine for $1. But we loved them. We matched them with windbreakers and scrunchies and felt like we belonged in a music video. And when we were not wearing ridiculous sunglasses, we were sticking our noses into the weirdest fad of all. Let us talk about the trend that brought scent to everything. Books, stickers, toys, and occasionally, regret. Before the internet, your childhood thrills came from simpler things, like scratch and sniff stickers. These were absolute gold in classrooms, sticker books, and birthday goodie bags. The premise was simple. Scratch the surface, take a sniff, and enjoy the tiny burst of scent. Some were awesome, Grape soda, bubblegum, peppermint. Others? Not so much. Wet dog, old cheese, burnt rubber. Why were those even options? But that was part of the fun. You never knew what you were getting. They popped up in storybooks, posters, notebooks, even dolls. Some smelled like your favorite snack. Others smelled like a science experiment gone wrong. The real issue? Over time, most of them turned. That once glorious banana scent started to reek like mildew. Your cherished pizza-scented sticker morphed into something that smelled like a shoe left in the sun. Still, these things were addictive. Collecting them was a competition. Trading them was an art. And proudly sticking one on your folder felt like decorating a trophy case. But if scent was the frontier, the next fad tried to leap into the future altogether. It promised technology, automation, and companionship. What it delivered was a robot that rolled in circles and maybe beeped once. In the 1980s, the dream of the future had a name: home robots. And none promised more, or delivered less, than toys like Omnibot. He was supposed to be your personal assistant. He had flashing eyes, a tray, a remote control, and a tape deck built into his chest. He looked like a cross between a blender and a traffic cone, but with a smile. The commercials were wild. They showed him serving drinks, waking kids up for school, even guarding the front door. In reality, he rolled about 1 foot per minute, beeped at unpredictable intervals, and dropped whatever you placed on his tray. If you were lucky, he made it across the living room before getting stuck on a carpet. But we loved him anyway. Because for a hot second, we believed the future was now. Even if the future ran on D batteries and got confused by floor lamps. Still, nothing summed up 1980s optimism like putting faith in a glorified plastic scooter. And if you thought that was useless, wait until we talk about a trend that was loud, crunchy in all the wrong ways. Your entire torso in a neon windbreaker, coming up next. If there was ever a book that made kids believe in magic, it was the Sears Christmas Wish book. Thick, glossy, and practically glowing with possibility, it dropped into your mailbox like a brick of joy every fall. You did not read it. You devoured it. The toy section alone could occupy an afternoon. You would flip through each page slowly, pen in hand, circling dreams like you were planning a heist. Bikes, action figures, dolls with blinking eyes, remote control cars the size of shoeboxes. It was all in there. You would fold corners, make notes, maybe even leave it open to the exact page your heart was set on and hope your parents noticed. This was not just a catalog. It was a seasonal ritual. The pages felt endless. Even if you never got the big-ticket items, it did not matter. Half the fun was imagining what you could get. And if you had siblings, you better believe there were rules about who got to look at it first. Some houses had it down to a science. A few minutes each, no hogging. But all that joy had a flip side. Because nothing could snap you out of toy-filled daydreams quite like a certain buzzing sound from the television, the kind that made your heart drop even if you did not know why. The 1980s really wanted men to care about gloves. Not work gloves, not winter gloves, but luxury comfort gloves. Enter Isotoner. They were supposed to be the Cadillac of handwear, sleek, stretchy, and backed by none other than Dan Marino himself. Yes, that Dan Marino. The glove was featured in ads where Marino would flash his hands like they were national treasures. The pitch was simple. Your hands deserve respect. The reality? Nobody was asking for this. These gloves were fine, but they were not revolutionary, and certainly not life-changing. Isotoner's massive ad campaign made the product feel overhyped and weirdly intimate. Like, why is Dan Marino caressing his own hands like that? It was one of those rare cases where the marketing machine worked too hard and ended up making the product feel silly. Plus, most people buying gloves in the 1980s were not doing it because of a sports endorsement. They were doing it because it was snowing. And if you think that is strange, just wait until we revisit one of the most dangerous playground toys to ever roll out of a toy aisle. Spoiler, it has no handles, no brakes, and absolutely no chill. Halloween in the 1970s was not a trip to a pop-up shop for a $30 superhero suit. It was a challenge, a test of creativity, a race to see who could turn a cardboard box and some tinfoil into a full-blown astronaut helmet or a robot torso. You begged your parents for old clothes, rummaged through closets for anything with a weird texture, and repurposed kitchen utensils into alien antennas. And then there were the masks. You know the ones. Thin plastic with elastic bands that snapped after 2 wears, tiny eye holes that never lined up with your face, and a mouth slit so small you could not breathe without fogging up the inside. But still, when it came time to trick or treat, you felt invincible. You became someone else. There was pride in a homemade costume. Nobody else on the block had it. You made it, with your own hands, or with your parents' help after dinner. And if your costume got torn or the rain made the paint run, you just kept going. Candy was candy, rain or shine, store-bought or not. But if you really wanted to earn something sweet, and not just from a pillowcase haul, you had to do a little hustling of your own. That meant going door to door, not for candy, but for glass bottles. Before the modern era of fancy sparkling water brands and sleek soda makers, there was the original SodaStream countertop fizzer. This was not the streamlined, minimalist version we see today. No, the 1980s model looked more like a miniature science project. It was bulky, confusing, and came with pressurized canisters that made a loud hiss every time you tried to carbonate something. The promise was simple: make your own soda at home. No more store runs, no more lugging 2 liters. Just add water, flavor, fizz, and boom, you had cola. Or at least something that vaguely tasted like cola. Cleanup was half the experience. Worst of all, it just never felt fun. Once the novelty wore off, it ended up buried in a cupboard next to the popcorn machine and the electric knife sharpener. It became the go-to housewarming gift that stayed in its box. A product built on convenience, undone by inconvenience. And speaking of inconvenient ideas, let us now shift from drinks to drip, because when Coca-Cola decided to make fashion a thing, it went flat faster than day-old soda. Blank VHS tapes were not just empty plastic boxes. They were treasure chests, the kind you could label, relabel, and fill up with your own little corner of television history. You remember the sound, right? That whirring click as the VCR accepted your latest recording project, whether it was The Muppet Show, a Disney movie airing on Saturday night, or just some random commercials you ended up watching later like they were rare artifacts. Back then, taping something off television was serious business. You had to time it perfectly. Hit record at just the right moment, or risk catching the tail end of a news anchor saying, "And now," before your show started. Fast-forwarding past commercials felt like a power move. Rewinding? An art form. And if you had one of those little tape rewinder machines shaped like a car, you were basically living in luxury. You wrote on those little white stickers with a level of care that rivaled school projects. Do not tape over. Disney only. Toys R Us ad. Keep forever. And when someone in the house recorded over your stuff with a football game, that was war. But if you wanted to really test your patience and your brain power, there was only one screen-based challenge that ruled them all. There was a brief, glorious moment in the 1980s when being a math nerd actually made you cool, and that was all thanks to the digital calculator watch. You could do basic math right on your wrist. Addition, subtraction, maybe a little division if you were feeling wild. These watches were sleek, futuristic, and they gave kids the illusion of being a young computer genius. But the novelty wore off faster than a sticker on a locker. Teachers banned them from classrooms almost instantly. Kids were using them to cheat on math tests or just to show off during spelling bees. Parents got tired of replacing batteries, and school administrators were not thrilled with little kids clicking away during morning announcements. Plus, if you had even slightly chubby fingers, good luck hitting the right button. It was a gadget that promised convenience, but delivered mostly frustration and a few detention slips. And while that fad disappeared into backpacks and sock drawers, another 1980s product was trying way too hard to sell itself with big names and bigger commercials. But even with a football legend at the front, it still missed the catch. Public service announcements in the 1980s were something else. You would be watching cartoons or a sitcom, then suddenly, boom. The screen would cut to a gray filter, eerie music, and a serious voice saying, "This is your brain. This is your brain on drugs." or a crash dummy flying through a windshield, or a puppet warning you not to talk to strangers. They were dramatic, unsettling, and weirdly unforgettable. One minute you were giggling at Garfield. The next you were wondering if touching a light socket would make you disappear forever. These announcements were designed to scare you straight. And they worked. They haunted your dreams and followed you into adulthood. Some used animation. Some used real actors with tear-streaked cheeks and slow zooms. And all of them felt like they were speaking directly to you. But even with the ominous tones, there was something strangely comforting about them. Like the world was trying to look out for you, even if it scared you a little. They were a strange part of growing up, and honestly, we would be lying if we said we did not remember them word for word. Still, if there was one thing that really balanced it all out, it was the glory of waking up at sunrise for the lineup of legends. Max Headroom was supposed to be the future, a computer-generated, sarcastic television host who stuttered stylishly and wore sunglasses at night. He was the face of a dystopian digital world, equal parts cyberpunk icon and artificial intelligence with an attitude. Advertisers loved him, especially soda companies, so someone had the bright idea. Let us give him a full television series. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. The Max Headroom show was visually interesting but narratively confusing. It tried to blend science fiction with satire, wrapped in glitchy editing and background noise. Most of the time, you were not sure if the show was broken or just being artsy. The plotline featured underground hackers, corrupt corporations, and a bleak media landscape, which ironically kind of predicted the internet. And Max, once a futuristic face of advertising, became more of a trivia answer at bar night. Still, his influence stuck around in weird ways. You can spot traces of Max Headroom in everything from video game villains to pop music videos. And if you thought that was sensory overload, wait until we talk about the time theaters tried to make movies smell like real life. If you wanted to feel indestructible in the 1970s, you bought a retired checker cab and drove it like your own private limousine. These things were built like bunkers. Steel frames, giant bench seats, enough legroom to host a yoga class. They were meant to haul passengers all day, every day, and because of that, they could take an unbelievable beating. When cities started retiring their fleets, the used cabs hit the market for dirt cheap, and everyday people scooped them up like hotcakes. You could legally register one as a personal vehicle, no questions asked. It was not unusual to see a checker cab parked in a suburban driveway, its faded yellow paint barely covered by an amateur paint job. They were impossible to miss and nearly impossible to wreck. Safety standards? They were considered built-in by sheer size and weight. Of course, they guzzled gas like nobody's business and cornered like a refrigerator on wheels, but hey, that was a small price to pay for invincibility. Eventually, they disappeared, retired for good. And speaking of unusual rides, let us not forget about the street-legal tuk-tuks and rickshaws that once rolled through American tourist towns like they belonged there. Alf was already pushing it. A sarcastic, wisecracking alien with a taste for cats and a flair for sitcom chaos. But somewhere between primetime success and pop culture overload, someone at the network thought, you know what this extraterrestrial needs? A late-night talk show. And thus, Alf's hit talk show was born. It aired in the early 2000s but carried every bit of that lingering 1980s energy. Awkward, loud, and trying way too hard to be relevant. Alf was seated behind a desk, conducting interviews with celebrities like he was the fuzzy, felt-lined love child of Johnny Carson and a stuffed animal from your attic. The jokes were mostly flat, the format was confusing, and the guests looked just as baffled as the audience. Nobody needed an alien talk show host, and certainly not one that looked like he was about to sell used cars in between segments. The show quietly vanished into the void, but Alf's attempt at late-night glory is still burned into the memory of anyone who stayed up past 11 p.m. with the remote in hand. And if Alf's fashion sense made you blink, wait until you see the workout gear that looked like it was designed by a highlighter. Paper routes were the ultimate crash course in growing up. It was not just a side gig. It was a rite of passage. You would get up before the sun, sometimes before your parents were even awake, pull on your jacket, and head out with that thick, canvas shoulder bag that nearly dragged on the ground. The newspapers were heavy, especially on Sundays. You would roll and rubber band them the night before or as you went, if you were brave. There was a rhythm to it. Walking house to house, tossing them just right so they landed near the door but not in the bushes. You knew which neighbors tipped, which ones complained, and which ones pretended they were not home when it came time to collect. And that was the part no one warned you about, the collection. You had to knock on doors, smile politely, and ask for your money. It was awkward. It was humbling. But it made you feel grown. You earned something. And if you saved up enough, you could finally buy that thing you had been eyeing for months. A new bike, a radio, or maybe a toy. But not just any toy. We are talking about the weirdest, creepiest, most unforgettable toy of the era. One with disguises, glue-on features, and a face you could never forget. Let's talk about Hugo, man of 1,000 faces. Imagine a pogo stick and a balance board had a baby, and then forgot to teach it physics. That was the Pogo Ball, also known as the Lolo Ball, and it was one of the hottest toy trends of the 1980s. It looked like a rubber volleyball stuck inside a plastic disc, and the goal was simple: stand on it and bounce. No handlebars, no foot straps, no guidance. Just you, your ankles, and a prayer. The commercials made it look effortless. Kids soaring through the air, spinning in place, landing cleanly like Olympic gymnasts. But in reality, most kids got 3 hops in before face planting into the pavement. Maybe it was the challenge. Or maybe we just liked pretending we had a shot at being the first Pogo Ball pro athlete. Either way, the toy quietly disappeared after too many accident-prone afternoons. It went from next big thing to garage sale classic almost overnight. And if that product made no sense, get ready for a toy so random and out of left field, not even He-Man fans knew what to do with it. That high-pitched tone, you remember it. You might even feel it in your chest right now. The emergency broadcast system test did not care what you were doing. It took over everything. You could be watching your favorite cartoon, a family sitcom, or a game show with flashing lights, and suddenly the screen would freeze, a gray static box would appear, and that bone-chilling noise would wail through the speakers. Then came the voice. Always monotone. Always distant. This is a test. This is only a test. Even though they told you it was just a drill, it still felt like the end of the world was knocking. You sat still, stared at the screen, and waited for it to go away. Some kids covered their ears. Others ran to find a parent. It was spooky in a way you could not explain. You did not know what nuclear war was, not really, but you knew this test meant something big, something adult, something terrifying. After a minute or two, it would vanish, and the show would come back on like nothing happened. But you felt different. That noise lived in your bones. Still, once the fear passed, you went back to being a kid. And in the 1970s, being a kid meant making your own fun, sometimes by putting on a show right in your backyard. The Atari MindLink sounds like something a supervillain would use to take over the world, but in reality, it was a headband, a plastic one, that claimed to read your thoughts and turn them into in-game controls. The promise was simple: no hands, no controllers, just your mind. And that promise immediately hit a brick wall called 1980s science. The MindLink was supposed to pick up electrical signals from your forehead muscles and translate them into commands. In practice, that meant you had to clench and twitch your brow in weird ways to move a pixel around the screen. The truth was that the MindLink was way ahead of its time, and not in a good way. It launched into testing and was quickly shelved when even Atari realized nobody wanted to win Space Invaders with their eyebrows. Maybe it would have worked better as a meditation trainer or a fancy headache inducer. Either way, the MindLink was canceled before it ever hit store shelves, and thank goodness, because if it had gone mainstream, we might all be sitting in silence, furrowing our brows to check email. Now let us move from mind control to media meltdown with a television icon who could not quite make the jump from cool to coherent. Before Fandango or streaming apps told us what was playing, there was the operator, and calling the theater was an event in itself. You would dial a number, usually a long one, and wait as a robotic voice or sometimes an actual person listed off every movie in showtime like it was the State of the Union. Showtimes for the weekend of July 24th, Gremlins at 7:30, The Goonies at 9:15, Ghostbusters at 10:45. You could not skip ahead. You had to listen carefully, and maybe even write it down if you were planning a big night. If someone in the house picked up the phone while you were listening, forget it. You had to start over. And if you called during a busy hour, good luck hearing anything over the static and background noise. But it was still exciting. The build-up, the anticipation. You felt like you were about to join something important, something bigger than yourself. Because back then, watching a movie meant going somewhere. It meant tickets, seats, sticky floors, and that one kid who always threw popcorn. It meant magic. But if you wanted movie magic at home, you did not need a theater. You just needed to clear your schedule, grab the good blanket, and stake your claim on the couch. Captain Power and the Soldiers of the Future. Even the title sounds like it is trying a little too hard. This was not just a show, it was an experience. It blended live-action television with interactive toys that could shoot and receive fire using light signals. The toys would respond to what was happening on screen. Miss a blast, lose points, hit a target, score. It was the 1980s equivalent of augmented reality. And for about 5 minutes, it felt revolutionary. But there was one small issue. It was unbelievably complicated. You needed the toys. You needed the right episodes. You needed everything lined up perfectly, or the experience just fell apart. Parents were not thrilled with having to buy an entire shelf of gear just to make the show playable. Kids got frustrated when their PowerJet XT7 refused to register a hit or randomly shut off mid-battle. The show itself was dark, overly serious, and way too intense for its age group. It felt like a war documentary with lasers. The toy-to-show synergy was ahead of its time, but far too messy to last. The dream of fusing television and toys never quite stuck the landing. But if you thought that was an ambitious media crossover, just wait until you hear about the time our favorite sarcastic alien tried to host his own late-night talk show. Making a mixtape in the 1980s was not just about the music, it was about what the music meant. This was not a playlist you could throw together in 5 minutes. This was a curated collection of feelings, carefully selected for maximum emotional impact. Every track had a purpose. Every order was intentional. You did not just make mixtapes for yourself. You made them for friends, for crushes, for breakups, for birthdays, for sitting in your room, staring at the ceiling, thinking deep thoughts you had no business thinking at that age. You would spend hours hitting pause and record, rewinding to check the transition, trying to fit exactly the right number of songs on each side without cutting one off too soon. There was a science to it, a rhythm, a philosophy, and then came the cover art. Doodles, stickers, fake band logos, scribbled lyrics, little hearts and broken hearts. The label on a mixtape said everything about who you were or who you wanted to be. These tapes were gifts, time capsules, emotional resumes. You gave one to someone and it meant something. It meant a lot. But if you did not have the patience or just wanted to cheat the system a little, you could always get a dozen albums for the price of a gumball. Almost. The 1980s were He-Man's golden hour. The action figures, the cartoon, the castles, it all worked. Until it did not. Enter the Meteorbs. These were plastic eggs that transformed into robotic dinosaurs and beasts. Sounds cool in theory, right? Well, not exactly. They were a spin-off that nobody asked for and few even understood. The Meteorbs came from outer space, at least according to the convoluted lore. And while He-Man's universe already had a lot going on, alien egg animals were a stretch too far. The figures were small, hard to transform, and did not mesh well with the bulkier, sword-wielding He-Man figures. You had warriors and sorcerers, and then a plastic orb that turned into a knockoff dragon. But the excitement faded quickly when kids realized these were more awkward than awesome. They were like the Happy Meal version of Transformers, but with less movement and more confusion. Even die-hard fans of Eternia looked at them and said, "I'm good." And speaking of complicated toys with a high learning curve, Let us talk about the interactive television show that thought kids were ready to join a live-action sci-fi war from their living room. In the 1970s, if you lived out in the country and owned a tractor, you basically owned a car, a truck, and a parade float all in one. Tractors were not just for farms, they were the rural equivalent of a commuter vehicle. Need to get to the store? Take the tractor. Dropping by your neighbor's house 3 miles down a dirt road? Tractor again. There was no need for plates, registration, or insurance. The rules were simple. If it moved and it did not break anything, it was fair game. Authorities looked the other way, because honestly, who was going to ticket the guy who also grew their corn? It was a slower time, and we mean that literally. You would see 20-mile-per-hour traffic jams with a full line of cars behind one of these beasts, and no one really minded. Today, you need plates, reflectors, and often a permit to drive a tractor even a block away from your land. But back then, tractors were as common on rural roads as pickup trucks, and a whole lot louder. Muscle pants for kids, that was the pitch. Somewhere, a grown-up looked at a child and said, "You know what this kid needs? Pants that scream steroid energy." These were Zubaz-style leggings with wild patterns and stretch material designed to mimic the bodybuilding look of adult gym rats. Except they were made for children. The problem was not just the patterns, which, by the way, included everything from neon zebra stripes to camouflage lightning bolts. It was that kids had no idea how to wear them. The pants were often too tight or too loose, and they came with this weird fake athletic vibe that clashed hard with the Sesame Street lunchboxes. These pants were a hard no. Schools started quietly banning them for being distracting, and parents got tired of explaining to teachers that no, their child was not training for a junior weightlifting championship. They were just victims of 1980s fashion. The trend came and went faster than you could say bicep curl. But speaking of trying too hard to look futuristic, let us talk about the time Atari thought your forehead could play video games. Going to the gas station used to be fun. I am not even kidding. In the 1970s, pulling into a station was not just about filling up the tank, it was about what you got for free. Gas station giveaways were the absolute jackpot of roadside errands. You would get real glassware, like full-on drinking glasses with cartoon characters or sports team logos printed on them. There were dishes, figurines, tiny toys, even aluminum tumblers in wild colors. Some stations had full sets you could collect over time, which meant every gas stop felt like you were unlocking a new piece in the puzzle. Parents would even choose where to fill up based on who had the best freebies that week. And kids? We kept track. We knew which stations had the cool tumblers and which ones were slacking. Sometimes they even gave out trading stamps to go along with your haul, so it was a 2-for-1 deal. You might not remember the cost of gas back then, but you definitely remember that little thrill when the attendant handed over your freebie through the car window. It was like a tiny prize for just living life. But if you think that was exciting, wait until you hear about the one thing that made kids count down the days from summer to winter, flipping through pages and circling dreams. Before the age of sleek athleisure and breathable fabrics, the 1980s gave us Diaglo workout gear. It was made from fluorescent neoprene, yes, that same thick, stretchy material you find in wetsuits, and it covered every inch of your body like your thighs owed someone money. Neon pink, electric green, traffic cone orange, you name it. Someone wore it to aerobics. The idea was to be bold, vibrant, and energetic. The result was usually something closer to a walking safety vest. These outfits were all over workout tapes, with instructors bouncing around in skin-tight ensembles that squeaked when they stretched. It made you sweat like you were jogging inside a microwave, and when you put it on, you looked less like a fitness enthusiast and more like someone who got lost on their way to a roller disco. Yet people bought them in droves, because the commercials promised that if you wore Diaglo, you were serious about your health and your fashion. But let's be real, it was more punishment than performance. Eventually, the trend burned out when everyone realized looking like a glow stick was not worth passing out mid-jumping jack. But if you thought sweating in neon was uncomfortable, just wait until we get into a home appliance that fizzled out almost as fast as it carbonated, literally. The greatest performers of the 1970s did not always have their names on marquees. Sometimes they were just the neighborhood kids putting on a backyard circus or a homemade talent show. And it was epic. Someone would make a hand-drawn poster using crayons and tape it to every mailbox on the street. Another kid would bring out a wobbly card table and pretend to sell tickets. You had gymnasts flipping through hula hoops, magicians fumbling through card tricks, and singers belting out radio hits into a hairbrush. If you had a dog that could sit, that dog was now part of the act. And your little brother? He was definitely going to be the assistant, whether he liked it or not. These shows were never perfect. Costumes fell apart, music cut out, and someone always cried halfway through. But it did not matter. The parents sat on folding chairs or blankets in the grass and clapped like they were at Radio City Music Hall. It was community. It was chaos. It was childhood. And when the show was over, the kids would bow, proud and breathless. But the moment you stepped back inside the house, another kind of performance was underway, trying to sneak in a private phone call when the entire household was listening in. Tell us which failed trend you actually miss, or which one still haunts your closet. And if you loved this nostalgic ride, go ahead and tap that like button, hit subscribe, and join us for the next blast from the past.